All right. Well, welcome to our lecture in Mora Nevuchim, lecture number, I think, 109. And when I refer to pages, for those that watch the recordings, I'm going to be referring to this edition, the Shlomo Pinas edition, volume 2. We'll be starting with page 494, the third paragraph. It starts, thereupon another opinion supervenes. That's where we were left off last week. Um, Before I start from where we left off, I want to address some issues. I see that Martin is not here right now, and he asked a question last week, but I talked to him this morning, and he said he's going to join. But either way, Martin Klinger is one of our Talmidim that joined us a couple of weeks back. But let me say, if you remember on 493 at the top, Rambam said, let me make sure that's where it is. The Rambam was talking about the process, and this we discussed this last time in detail, the process that Job went through, the questions he asked about why he's suffering, the terrible, horrific suffering that he's having, and that he went through this process of arguing and talking to the friends that visited him, the first three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who basically, for the most part, took a much more simplistic understanding of God's providence and would say, Eov, you must have done something to deserve this. And we talked a little bit last week about the discussions back and forth. But at the top of 493, the Rambam made a point that Eov, by the end of the Sefer, came to recognize that the ultimate goal is not the happiness that we get through physical pleasures that we have in this world. So it's not the wealth and the children and the health and the good things that we get in this world that we should be looking for. And when we look for those things, we then are tempted to we're tempted. We ask the questions, well, why is it if I lived life properly, why am I not getting those things, right? I should be getting those rewards, which leads one to question, does God really care, right? And in other words, leads to all those questions that Eov was asking. Does God watch? Does he care? Does he control, etc.? And then he said, but in the end, the ultimate goal is not those things, but the ultimate goal is knowledge. And when Eov understood at the end that it's that knowledge, and we are understanding this in the context of having studied Mor Nevuchim together now for several years, and we're starting to understand that to the Rambam, the ultimate goal is knowledge of God, right? And it's knowledge, and we've said this before, we've mentioned this before, it's knowledge and love of God. And that is the only thing that really, really counts, that really, really matters. So Martin mentioned last week a question, but okay, that sounds fine, but the way he put it was very sharp. Was does did the Rambam live through with all kinds of suffering that Eov did? Like, it kind of almost makes it like that's an easy thing to say if you didn't just lose all of your children, all of your wealth, and you weren't lying in the dirt covered in boils, and nobody cares about you, and you're living in a horrific physical pain, right? and and it's a challenge that, and I mentioned, I quoted James Diamond, who's one of the big greatest Maimonidean scholars around today. He writes a lot. I'm pretty sure it's from the University of Toronto, about how the Rambam seems to fall up short. Like, how do you tell this to someone who's suffering? So I wanted to say the way I understand the Rambam and the way I understand why the Rambam is relevant, is not just relevant, but it's so powerful, and even can even be said in the context of the worst and most awful suffering a person can imagine. Hello, Martin. I just quoted you. So now Martin, I quoted you. So we're about to, and I'm glad you joined. So what I'm going to do is I want to read to you, what does the Rambam mean when he says achieve this knowledge, right? What is this knowledge that is the goal of everything, that is really the only thing that matters, despite all the terrible suffering that a person can go through. So I want to read to you just a small passage from the Rambam himself in the Mishnah Torah. In Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, it literally means the foundations of the Torah, the second chapter, where he talks about what it means to achieve love of God. And specifically, I want to focus and zero in on that idea of love because it's going to be really important for a lot of reasons. But following, it's a short piece, but it's really crucial to understanding what the Rambam means here. What is he talking about? That Eov, by the end of the book, achieved knowledge and realized that that's all that really matters. What is he talking about? So let me read this to you. So again, it's Mishnah Torah, the Sefer Hamada, Perek Beis of Yisodei HaTorah, and it's the second seif, it's the second paragraph. And he says that he's following up what he just mentioned. There's a command for us to love and be in awe of God. To have ahava and yira. Yira is often translated fear, but that is a mistranslation. Ahava means love, and yira means awe of God. Okay, so he starts to describe how one achieves a level of love. And I'm going to read it carefully. At the time when a person thinks about God's actions, and his creations, haniflaim, that are wondrous, in other words, that blow our minds when we see them, hagidolim, that are so large, and he sees from this God's wisdom, she'ein la'erach, that there is no value, there is no way to assess his wisdom. V'lo kates, there is no end to his wisdom. Miyad, immediately, hu ohev u'mishabeach, he loves and he praises, u'mifoer, and he gives a wondrous accolades, u'misaveh, and he's filled with a tremendous desire, ta'ava gedolah, leida Hashem hagadol, to know this great God, to know this great name, right? So David, like David said, Tzoma nafshi leElohim leElchai, right? And my soul thirsts for the living God. So I want you to think about those words that I just read, because what the Rambam here is saying, right, is thinking about the wondrous creations of God and how beyond our capabilities are to understand how wondrous and how amazing they are. You're filled with this love for God. This is the ultimate knowledge. It's just a few sentences of the Rambam. This knowledge is what Eov achieved at the end. Now, how does that help? Okay, so I tell this to a guy who just went through everything Eov went through. So I want to read to you. I have no right to say this because I saw Weinreb. I've had my ups and downs in life, but I never, thank God, never even came close to, even remotely close to, the kind of suffering that Eov went through, right? I've ventured to guess that there isn't a single person here in this group, and if there is, I beg your forgiveness, but I highly doubt many of us have went through all kinds of things that I can't even imagine. But to imagine the suffering of Eov, that's something that is hard for us to encounter. However, there are people who do have the right to say such a thing, who do have a right to talk about the worst possible suffering. And I'm going to read from you from two books, right? That most of you are probably familiar at least with one of them, hopefully both. And if you're not, then you cannot leave this planet before you read both of these books. So you have to promise me that you will, okay? Because you cannot be a human being if you don't know these books. I'm telling you, I mean that with all this, every bit of my soul. The first one is by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. So you have to know this book, and if you don't, you must read it. But now I'm going to read to you just a little bit from Viktor Frankl. And I wanted to ask you if it sounds to you like he understood. So here he was in Auschwitz, having lost everything imaginable, having lost anything he's ever owned, having lost almost everything. You can't imagine Auschwitz. That, I think, gives you the right to say, I can talk about the suffering of Job, right? The starvation, the illness, the sickness, the pain, the physical pain, the torture, the so on, so forth, the unimaginable suffering. But listen to what he says, right? About Man's Search for Meaning. And I'm on page 37 of the edition that I'm reading. And he said, that brought thoughts of my own wife to mind as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward. Nothing was said. Each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image. imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. I'm going to skip one or two sentences. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world may still know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved, in a position of utter desolation when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, the angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory. In, um, and I don't know, like, I'm just going to read the last. Well, this intensification, I'm on page 39 now. This intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence by letting him escape into the past. When given free rein, his imagination played with past events and so on. So I don't know how to say this, but uh, Viktor Frankl has the right to say this, right? He's a person who lived the kind of suffering that Eov lived through. And it was through his mind, through his intellect, through his thinking of, in his case, he latched onto an image, the image of his wife, something that had meaning, something that had importance, right? Devotion to something that had meaning and the beauty of it. That love that he felt in his heart enabled him to get through the worst possible suffering. I want to take note of the incredible similarity between Rambam's description of the love of God to Viktor Frankl's description here of the love of the image he had in his mind of his wife. Keep that in mind because that is what the Rambam is talking about, right? It's not some just la-di-da, idea of just you can rise above it in your mind and bear any suffering. No, this is for real. This is the truth. Okay. The truth is that even in the worst, I don't know if I would have the strength to do what he did. I hope I would. God forbid, I hope none of us ever even come close to having to live through something like that. But this is what the Rambam is saying. And this is what the message being, and I'm going to read the second book in a minute. But what the Rambam is saying is that of course we want to have health. Of course we want to have wealth that we need. Of course we want to have healthy children. Of course we want to have a good reputation. Of course we want to have all the things that we want to have in this world, right? But we have to remember the bottom line is that all of those things are physical things that can be taken away in a second, right? And that's the lesson of Eo. Ultimately, the only thing we have, even when we're living with all of that stuff, the only thing that's important is the love of God, right? Now, I know that in the images that we're reading from Viktor Frankl, I'm about to read from this is the other book, The Choice by Edith Eger. Okay, so if you haven't read this, please get it. She happens to be a devotee, a student of Viktor Frankl, and she's a psychologist who is also a survivor of Auschwitz. Okay, and she again was in Auschwitz. You don't need me to describe that she has the right to say what she said. Okay, she can say that I know what suffering of Eov is like. And she describes what just an awful, I can't even, there's no words for the kind of experience this was. She was a young girl, a teenager who was a competitive, I think, dancer or gymnast prior to the war in Hungary, such that she was like an elite, a team, I think maybe the Olympics, I can't remember, to some big competition, but then she was kicked off the team because she was Jewish, and then eventually she ended up in Auschwitz. And when Mengele himself came to her bunk where she was with a bunch of girls in Auschwitz, and because he heard that there was a famous dancer there, and she describes, and I'm not going to read it, I'm on page 40 of this edition that I'm reading called The Choice, and she describes what happened when Dr. Mengele came and walks into the room and singles her out and says, "Little dancer, dance for me." I can't, the reading the words, it just rips my heart to pieces. But I'm gonna just read what goes on, what she describes, what went on in her mind when she had to stand in Auschwitz in conditions that we can't even comprehend, right? And dance for Mengele, for the one of the most evil human beings that's ever walked this planet. She says, I focus on my routine, on my years of training, each line and curve of my body like a syllable and verse, my body telling a story. A girl arrives at a dance. She spins in excitement and anticipation. Then she pauses to reflect and observe. What will happen in the hours ahead? Whom will she meet? She turns towards a fountain, arms sweeping up and around to embrace the scene. She bends to pick up flowers and tosses them one at a time to her admirers and fellow revelers, throwing flowers to the people, handing out tokens of love. I can hear the violins swell. My heart races. In the private darkness within, and listen carefully to this sentence, I hear my mother's words come back to me, as though she is there in the barren room, whispering below the music. Just remember, no one can take away from you what you've put in your own mind. Dr. Mengele, my fellow starved to the bone inmates, the defiant who will survive and the soon to be dead, even my beloved sister disappear, and the only world that exists is the one inside my head. I'll stop there, but the point that she's making is exactly the point that the Rambam is trying to say. And that is that what goes on in our minds, what goes on in our heart is ultimately when everything else goes bad is all that we have left. And that image, to achieve that level of love of God, right, which he described in Yesod Torah, is what keeps us going. That should be our objective. That should be what we value, even when we're not, God forbid, suffering at all, let alone the kinds of suffering that Eov and the people and Edith Eger and Viktor Frankl went through, right? That's what the Rambam means, right? And that's the realization that Eov had at the end, when all he was doing throughout the entire book was asking God, why am I suffering? Why am I here in Auschwitz? Why am I suffering? Why did my family die? Why did every single person I know suffer? Why do I have to suffer getting whipped and beaten and starved and live through typhus and God knows what other kinds of suffering over and physical labor that can't even be imagined? Why? Where's all the wealth that I'm supposed to have? I was good. You have no answers to such questions. We don't. We never will have answers to such questions. But what we do know is that what's in my own mind, as Edith Eger remembered from her mother, nobody can control what you put in your own mind. You're the only one that has control over that. And it's that knowledge and it's that love, if we can recognize and still have love for God, even under those circumstances, that's what it means. That is what the Rambam is talking about. So I wanted to lay that out there because as we read through the rest of this chapter 23, I want you to think about what I said about how the Rambam talked about looking at the wonders of God and the incredible things that he's created and coming to a love of him, right? Which is our goal, and that's what's important. So I'm going to start from thereupon. Now let's get back to the Rambam. After all the opinions that I mentioned, Bildad and Sofar and all those, one of them wanted to say, oh, you can't ask any questions on God, no questions allowed, right? And one of them said, God just does what he does and that's it. Others were saying, no, you have to repent. You must have been terrible. You must have done something wrong, right? You're just not admitting it to yourself and so on. And Eov kept on insisting, no, I know I'm innocent. I know I don't deserve this. All that back and forth. Someone else shows up, a fourth friend named Elihu, right? And then for those, I reviewed the structure of the book of Eov last time when we were together. But so the three friends argue with Eov back and forth for 30 chapters or so. And then another friend comes, a fourth one named Elihu, who's supposed to be the wise one who has something better to say, something more to say. And Elihu goes on through chapter and chapter in which it's hard to discern exactly what he's saying that's somehow new from everyone else. So so another opinion supervenes, namely the one attributed to Elihu. And he is considered by them as superior. For it is mentioned he was the youngest in the point of age, the most perfect in knowledge. He started to reprove. The reason why he kept his mouth shut the whole time was because he said, out of respect for the elders, but he says, after you older people get babbled on and don't know what you're talking about, it's time for me to talk, right? So he piped in. So he started to reprove Eov and to tax him with ignorance. because of his having manifested his self-esteem. Because he tells Eov, you are thinking of everything in your own self-interest. In other words, all you're thinking about is your wealth, your health, your children, and your behavior, and trying to compare and contrast, right? But it's not about that. That's not what life is about. We're going to see in a minute where Elihu is going to, right? Of course, we all naturally think that way, but and because of his not being able to understand how misfortunes could have befallen him, though he performed good deeds, right? For he had expiated at length on the goodness of his actions. So, and Eov was saying, well, how could it be that I'm suffering if I did good? Why don't I have health? Why don't I have wealth? Etc., etc. He also described the opinions of Eob's three friends on providence as senile drivel, and made extraordinary speeches that are full of enigmas. He criticized them for, who are you? What are you talking about? Eov here. You know who he's. Why are you criticizing him? You're telling him as if he's a sinner. Like, well, what's wrong with you guys? He criticized them all in such a way that if someone considers his discourse, he wonders and thinks that he does not in any respect make an addition to what was said by Eliphaz, Bildad, and so far. He criticizes them, but when he makes a point, it's hard to tell what he says that the others hadn't said already, but merely repeats in different terms and with amplifications the notions contained in their speeches. For he does not go beyond blaming Eov, ascribing the attribute of justice to God, describing his wonders in the universe, and stating that he may be exalted, does not care either for the obedience of those who obey or for the disobedience of those who disobey, right? He went through the same mental process. Does God really care? Does God not care? Do we see God's justice in this world? And Elihu admitted that we don't see it. You look around, let's be real. Do we see it? No. We see plenty of people that we wouldn't think deserved wealth, and they're walking around and driving their fancy cars, right? And we see plenty of people who we know are great, who are suffering through all kinds of terrible things. Now, all these notions had been expressed by its companions. All those questions and issues, if you read through the last 35 chapters, it's all there. So what did Elihu add? However, when you consider the matter, the additional notion that he introduced will become clear to you. You're going to have to trust Rambam on this. And I told you all that you have to go and read Eov, but I'm sure nobody did. Maybe somebody did. Okay. But then you'll understand where he's getting all this from. But if you really look carefully, you'll see what Elihu says that's different, right? It had not occurred before to one of the others. Together with that notion, however, and Rambam didn't tell us what the notion is. He's going to say it in a minute. He says all that they have said, just as each of all the others, namely Job and his three friends, repeats, as I have mentioned to you, the notion expressed by another among them. In other words, yes, he does go through the same mental process, the same questions, the same spiritual angst, the same issues of theodicy that we all go through. Why? Elihu goes through the same process, right? However, this is done in order to hide the notion that is peculiar to the opinion of each individual, so that at first it occurs to the multitude that all of them are the same. However, this is not so. In other words, Elihu bunches all of the questions together. Like we talked last week about the difference between each of the three friends. Elihu just goes through all of their points and counterpoints, right? Just bunching them all together as if it's the same. Even though it's not true that they were the same, there were differences, as we pointed out before, but that's not the point for Elihu. The point for Elihu is that all of you are missing something. The notion added by Elihu and not mentioned by one of them, and it's going to sound a little strange in the beginning, I'm warning you, but if you listen carefully, you'll understand that it's not strange at all, right? In that which he expresses parabolically when he speaks of the intercession of an angel. Elihu talks about how in your prayer, you can pray, and an angel might help intercede between you and God. Now, what is this talking about? Okay, and hold that thought for a minute. I know that sounds a little odd, but I promise you it'll make a lot of sense in a second. For he says that it is a tested and well-known thing that when a man is ill to the point of death, and when he is despaired of, even if you're at the point of the worst suffering, if an angel intercedes for him, if an angel comes, regardless what the angel is, then intercession is accepted and he is raised from his fall. This invalid is accordingly saved and restored to the best of states. You can get back to where you want to be. What is this angel? However, this does not continue always, for there being no continuous intercession. That angel isn't always there. That angel is up to you, whether you have that angel intercede on your behalf, right? However, this does not, it doesn't go on forever. It takes place 2 or 3 times. He says, if there be for him an angel, an intercessor, and so on. And having described the various states of the convalescent and his joy at returning to the perfection of health, he says, lo, All these things does God do once, twice, maybe three, yeah, even three times with a person. This notion is made clear by Elihu alone. Now, what is an angel? Now, for here, the Rambam is relying on the fact that you've been studying, right, Mor Nevuchim until now, and you know what he's talking about, right? If you haven't been studying Mor Nevuchim and I tell you about an angel, you're thinking about a spiritual being, maybe with wings that flies around, right? Right? But if you've been studying Mor Nevuchim with me for the past 2.5 years, you know what the Rambam means when he sees the word angel, right? An angel is a force of nature, right? And an angel is are those levels through which God communicates with man, right? Right? The levels we said God communicates with man through each sphere. There's an intelligence, which is an angel that runs each sphere. Remember that was Aristotelian physics, and that angel speaks to the one below it, to the one below it, to the one below it, until he gets to our mind, to our active intellect. The angel interceding between us and God in the Rambam's uh, psychological model, psychic model, cognitive model is our psyche, is our mind, is our active intellect that we use, right, to think and to directly relate to God, to bring wisdom and truth into our actions and behavior, right? The angel interceding, according to the Rambam, is assuming that you know what he's talking about, right? Right? So what Elihu added was, how do you restore yourself? Right? Through a revelatory experience, through that experience of love and relationship to God. And hold that for a minute because we're going to see it as the Rambam describes it a little bit more. He also makes an addition, another addition, Elihu says, right? Prior to speaking of this notion, by beginning to describe the how of prophecy, right? Remember, we talked about prophecy, and Rambam told us in the levels of prophecy, we all have access to the lower levels of prophecy through our active intellect, through the process which I just described. All of us have access to that, right? Now, for God speaketh once, yes, twice, yet man perceives it not. God is talking to us, we're just not listening, right? In a dream, in a vision of a night, when deep sleep fall upon men, when we have these visions and ideas and so on, these are things through which we can communicate with God. And this is what it means. Think about the dream state that Edith Eger described when she was standing in front of Mengele and asked to dance, right? Her mind went somewhere. Her brain went somewhere. In the worst possible suffering, her mind, her heart went to a place of love, right? This is exactly what the Rambam is talking about, right? This is the state of mind which we can enter in the worst possible suffering. Thereupon he begins to confirm this opinion and to make clear its method by describing many natural circumstances. Right away, remember I quoted from Yesodei HaTorah, the Rambam. Right away, what do you think? What do you and I think about if we want to even get a tiny inkling of that love, right? What do you and I think about? We think about that so many natural circumstances in the world, the thunder, the lightning, the rain, the blowing of the winds, things that are beyond us, powerful, incredibly wonderful and powerful things of nature. I mean an outbreak of pestilence referred to in his dictum. In a moment they die, even at midnight, and so on. The occurrence of great wars referred to in his dictum. You know, terrible, awesome things, terrible, powerful things, mighty men without number, and so on. Similarly, I just turned the page to 496, and I'm starting the big chapter there, the big paragraph. I'm sorry. Similarly, you will find that in the prophetic revelation that came to Eov. So if you look at Eov at the end, the prophetic revelation, meaning when God finally came and spoke. The last few chapters are when after Elihu spoke, and kind of you feel like Elihu got a little closer to the truth, then God comes and speaks the truth. And what does God speak? You really have to read it because it's several chapters of a monologue from God. I think it's the only place in the entire Tanakh where you have, such a long, basically a speech. It's like you went to a play, paid for some tickets, and God got up there on the stage and gave a whole soliloquy. It's incredible to read. Obviously, it's Tanakh. You should read it. But the thing is that so that was a nevuah. That was a prophecy that came to Eov. What was in that prophecy? What did God talk about? He talked about the wonders of his creation, right? And I'm going to read the Rambam's quick summary of several chapters of Eov, right? And through which his error in everything that he had imagined became clear to him. There is no going beyond the description of natural matters. God never tells Eov about the wonders that are above this world, right? He doesn't tell him about the spiritual, godly things that you and I really have no access to. We can't understand God. Rambam told us that a million times, right? But God talks to him about the things we do see, but that are still so incredible that we can't fathom them, right? The description of the elements, description of the meteorological phenomena, the stars and the shooting stars and the moon and the rotating planets and things that we see and we can even measure and sometimes even feel or taste, but they're so awesome that we can't understand them. For what mentioned therein in the way of a description of the firmaments and the heavens and Orion and the play, he talks about all the different constellations, occur because of their influence upon the atmosphere. He draws his attention only to what is beneath the sphere of the moon, and then he talks about what is on this world when we look at it around, in the sublunary universe. Elihu too derives his warning. Elihu was saying the same things as God was in those cases, right? From species of animals, he says, "Who teaches us from the beasts of the earth and makes us wise in the fowls of heaven?" He dwells at the greatest length at the description of the Leviathan, some sort of a sea creature, sea beast, or whatever. Which is the combination of corporeal properties divided between animals that walk, swim, and fly. The purpose of all these things is to show that our intellects do not reach the point of apprehending how these natural things that exist in the world of generation and corruption are produced in time. We see things that are incredible right in front of us. Go into your backyard and look up at the sky. Look at a tree. Look at the sea. Go diving and see the incredible creatures of the sea. Go climb a mountain and look at the views. We see things that are beyond, that we can't comprehend, that we can't explain. Yes, sure, you can get a scientific theory that explains this, and that, and the other thing, but ultimately, the entirety of it all is so massive, it's so incredible, right? They are not things that resemble what we make. You and I, if I made something, I can cook myself, something for dinner, but that's about all I can do, right? But God is so beyond us in the things that he can achieve. We can't even comprehend him. Right? They are not things that resemble what we make. How then can we wish that his governance of and providence for them may be exalted, should resemble our governance of and providence for the things we do govern and provide for? How then do we even imagine, if I think of my greatest achievement, I don't know, let's say I came up with the best surgery I ever did, right? Or the most incredible diagnosis I ever came up with. It's pretty incredible. I diagnosed a young lady with celiac disease based on her periods. Okay, so you can ask me how I did that later. So I was really proud of myself. Okay, but that's the best I can do. All right, as a doctor, and we can all think, but it didn't even. I mean, it's not even 1/1000th of a billionth of a billionth of a trillionth of what God does. Right? I mean, it's not even can compare on a quantitative level. It's qualitatively in a different realm. Right? So So how could we expect that the way God's going to run his world is the same way that you and I run the world, right? If you and I were deciding who should be rich and who should be poor, we might sit with a sheet and say, he's a good guy. He crossed the lady across the street and held her hand. All right, rich. And this guy, he was an idiot. He cut off somebody in traffic. Poor, done. Easy, right? You and I would do that. But that's not how God works. How could we even think? And that's the arrogance that Elihu was accusing Eov of, right? How do you even think that God's providence should reflect what you think providence should be? How do you think that God's governance should reflect what you think God's governance should be? So rather, it is obligatory to stop at this point and to believe that nothing is hidden from him may be exalted. As Elihu says, for his eyes are upon the ways of man, he seeth all his goings. But the notion of his providence is not the same as the notion of our providence, nor is the notion of his governance of things created by him the same as the notion of our governance of that which we govern. Right? The two notions are not comprised in one definition. We might use the word governance, but it's not the same thing. We have only one term to use, but they really deserve two different terms. We can't describe God's governance by using human language. So the best thing we have is the language that we use, but it's not the same thing. Contrary to what is thought by all those who are confused, the people who are asking those questions, why, all those questions, they're confused because they're thinking that it should reflect what a human being thinks, right? They're thinking that fairness should look like what we think fairness should look like. In the same way, our act does not resemble his act, and the two are not comprised in one and the same definition. Just as natural acts differ from those of craftsmanship, so do the divine governance of, the divine providence for, and the divine purpose with regard to these natural matters differ from our human governance of, providence for, and purpose with regard to the things we govern, we provide when we purpose. This is the object of the book of Iyov as a whole. I refer to establishing of this foundation. So the bottom line of Sefer Iyov, after Rambam discussed for many weeks now, we've been talking about Rambam's analysis of Sefer Iyov. The bottom line of the Sefer Iyov is the establishing of this foundation for the belief and the drawing attention to the inference to be drawn from natural matters that look at the world around you, draw an inference from the world around you, and understand this idea, right? So that you should not fall into error and seek to affirm in your imagination that his knowledge is like our knowledge and his purpose like his providence. Because from the world, you can see that he is in a different category as us. Just look around you and you'll know right away that God is, you can't ask such questions of God. And that's the answer. That's the answer that the book of Iyov is telling us, according to Rambam. If man knows this, every misfortune will be borne lightly by him. And had I not read to you from Edith Eger and Viktor Frankl, you could have asked what Martin asked us last week, right? That how could the Rambam say such a thing? But the Rambam could say such a thing because it's true, right? Every misfortune will be borne lightly by him, and not that it's easy, God for, and not that God forbid can anyone ever point the finger and say, oh, you just do what Frankl did and you'll be fine. I don't mean it that way, and it sounds awful to even think like that. But it is true. It is absolutely true that this is how we should get through our teeny tiny little minor little inconveniences that we call suffering, right? If we, lose a job, we get insulted by work, we miss out on a promotion, whatever it is that we're going through, or even more serious things, God forbid, terrible illness in our family, things like that, and loss, premature loss. We can't never take away from the awful suffering that's caused by these things. But ultimately, how do you bear this misfortune when it comes to your relationship with God is by remembering and understanding, right? The greatness of God and your love for him, right? And the image we need to have in mind is the image of all the beautiful things that he created in this world. And misfortunes will not add to his doubts regarding the deity and whether he does or does not know, and whether he exercises providence or manifests neglect. All those questions that you had, right? All of those doubts, right? Right, that you have about God and whether he cares what we do, whether he controls what happens in this world. On the contrary, it will add to his love. And that's where I was driving at the whole time. This is a long version of those few sentences that I mentioned to you from Hilchos Yesodei Torah, from the Rambam and Mishnah Torah. The short version, this is the long version. The short version is you look at the world around you and you will experience love for God. Now, the Rambam doesn't say it's easy. It's a very difficult and long process. But it is a possible process for a human being to have to achieve that love. If you achieve that love, you can get through anything because that's the only thing that we really have. Everything else can pop away in 2 minutes. Everything we're relying on today that we think is cool could end tomorrow. But that love will not go away no matter what. As it is said in the conclusion of the prophetic revelation in question, wherefore I abhor myself and repent of dust and ashes, right? The ultimate thing was Iyov's recognition of himself and his own humility. I am just dust and ashes. I'm just a human being, right? That's all I am. In comparison to God, I'm nothing but dust and ashes. As the sages said, those who do out of love and are joyful in sufferings. Okay, so that's the bottom line here. How do you be joyful in sufferings? That it's described by the Rambam until now. If you meditate upon everything I have told you, Rambam says, and this is how we're going to end this chapter, and with the attention that ought to be practiced in meditating upon this treatise, and if you consider this Sefer Iyov, its meaning will become clear to you, and you will find that I have summed up all its notions, nothing being left aside except such matters as figure there, because of the arrangement of the discourse and the continuation of the parables, according to what I've explained to you several times in this treatise. So that really concludes the Rambam's analysis of Iyov and his understanding of the problem of theodicy. Um, I hope I did it some good justice. There's obviously more to go. There's more to do when we discuss the Odyssey. Um, but the next chapter, I'm just gonna. It's also long, and he talks a lot about the idea of a nisayon, of a trial. Of God testing us. So what does that mean? Like, why would God test us? That kind of thing. So that's what we're heading for in chapter 24. So we have a lot of really cool stuff to do. But ultimately, I'm going to stop here for today, and we'll take discussion time. If anyone has anything they want to add, ask, etc.
I just have one quick question.
Yes.
Hashem ends with rebuking Eov first because it was a conversation between him and Eov, but then he rebukes the three friends, but he doesn't rebuke Elihu.
Yeah.
So,
Because
so
the Rambam would say, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I should let you.
no, just that's the question basically. Like what we just learned about Elihu from the Rambam. So what?
Because the Rambam would say that Eliyahu was on the right track. You know, he was on the right track, so he didn't deserve to be criticized, right? I mean, according to the way the Rambam presented it, and obviously there's a lot of other ways to understand Sefer Iyov, right? But according to the way the Rambam understands the whole book, Elihu was God was really almost just continuing from Elihu, like taking it a little farther, but Elihu was on the right track, so he didn't deserve criticism.
So I've got one question to ask. In
Mhm.
spite of the fact that you have this feeling of love and understanding of and awe of God,
Right,
you're still suffering and you still have bad things happening.
right.
And it's sort of interesting if you look at the Buddha's approach to this.
Hmm.
Basically, Buddha says you don't expect to be successful. You don't expect your goals and plans. You don't plan and say, I'm hoping that this will happen. I accept the fact that this may not. And in fact, most of the time it won't. And you have to accept the fact that you'll be set back or have problems or suffering. And therefore you just accept that and you come to peace with it and you feel good about it. Is there any correlation with what you're saying with any of that?
I'm not familiar enough with Buddhism to tell you to answer the question, like really answer the question. But based on what you just said, and based on the teeny, teeny, tiny bit that I know about Buddhism, there definitely is a correlation. This wisdom is not just unique. Ramam would absolutely be the first person to admit that this wisdom we all have access to, Jewish or not, Torah or not, right? Have this active intellect is a human quality, right? And this quality is something which we can all recognize. If all of us do this process, we can endure that kind of suffering, and not just endure it, but embrace the life that we have. So absolutely, I mean, I don't know enough about Buddhism to say that, yeah, it's the same thing that the Rambam says. But to say that there's a lot of similarity and they seem to be going on the same track, I think is very clear. And you'll find this not just in the Rambam and Buddhism. You'll find this across the spiritual universe. You'll find the truly spiritual people in just about every religion ever existed. You'll find a similar pattern of thought, and this idea there's all kinds of terms coming in touch with yourself but but the enduring all kinds of suffering, because I read to you about the Holocaust, which is one of the worst examples in human history, but certainly not the only example of terrible, terrible human suffering. And people, hopefully, we can come to this realization like without having to go through suffering. And we can experience. Our goal would be to experience this love without having to, God forbid, endure such terrible things. But
And
absolutely,
that,
yeah.
yeah, and that's sort of where I was going. In fact, that if you don't expect a good life or riches or whatever, you just
Mhm.
expect that you do things and things may turn out bad, but you accept the fact that that happens
Mhm.
and and understand that there is a greater good that is God and love. But see, that's where I don't see the connection with what they're saying, what you're saying with Job at this point. It still doesn't explain what happens with the suffering, you see. And because there was an expectation of Job that he would be rich, that he would have all these good things and family and so forth. My point is, what does Judaism speak to in terms of handling that part of the suffering, but beyond going ahead and making the jump to say love God and loving the awe of God? Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so the bottom line is that that's where what comes in, what Rambam was telling us, that we don't understand God's providence. We don't understand God's governance, right? We cannot explain why we suffer, right? When it's not fair, right? We can't explain it, right? We can survive it. We can maybe find love despite it or within it or however you want to say. But we ultimately will never be able to explain because we're human beings and we cannot understand how God works, right? So to pretend that God should act the way we think he should act is arrogance, right? We don't know why are children born with genetic diseases, right? Raman brought that example several times. There's no way any human being can explain that to you, right? It can't be
Well,
explained.
see, what I'm saying is the difference between explanation and expectation. So people have expectations of having a happy
Right. So
life,
we have to not have such
healthy,
expectations.
healthy, brilliant children, and so on. So,
Right.
but what I'm trying to say is, in more or less, it's saying the same thing. God, we can't understand what God is doing in those realms,
Hmm.
and therefore we should probably accept the fact that maybe things will not be good and be happy with the fact that when they are, but accept the
Right.
fact that most of the time it may not be. And that's sort of
100%.
that really is that's it gets into Buddhism to some degree. They
Mhm.
state a very similar thing.
Yeah,
That's what I'm.
no, so you're right, and I agree, and it probably it does sound very similar to Buddhism, and it probably is the same idea, that we should not expect. The Rambam said, if we go back to like I read, Job imagined things that thought to be happiness, health and wealth and children are the ultimate goal, right? So then you start falling into these questions. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily that way. Not everyone can have children. Not everyone has health. Not everyone has wealth, right? That person might be me. It might be you, right? Um, the Rambam does say throughout, and it's only a person like Eov, right, who understood this, who was able to later on, who survived this terrible event, and was able to keep on going and eventually regain health and wealth and happiness, right? Someone who doesn't have who doesn't appreciate this true happiness could never go on afterwards, right? Imagine a Viktor Frankl would never have been able to go on to a very distinguished career in psychiatry after the war, right? If he did not have that kind of inner strength, right? So any of us if we were to go through suffering in life and get slammed and not have this inner happiness that we have despite all of that, there's no way we'd be able to overcome that and move forward, right? So having this feeling, having this knowledge does make it more likely that you will have wealth and health, right? because because but we can't do it for that reason with that expectation. That was your term, expectation,
That's
right?
my time. Yeah,
Right.
expecting it to happen.
Right.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
why I said last time why that stupid song, that it's just that stupid song that's singing now. Um Odio Tertov, Odio Tertov. It's a popular song in Israel today that everyone's singing. It's going to be better and better. And then the song continues, we're going to have wealth, we're going to have health, everyone's going to find the shidduch, and everything's going to be great. It's the opposite. It's the absolute polar opposite of what the Rambam is teaching here, right?
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
In other words, that's not what we're yearning for. That's not what we're praying for. Of course we want it, right? Of course I want to be healthy. Of course I want to be, so on, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't even pray for those things, but prayer for those kinds of things is a whole subject in itself. But I'm not saying we shouldn't pray for those things. But ultimately, what's good? What's good is what's in our heart and in our mind, right? That's good. That's tov, right? And that is And that is what Eov ultimately achieved when he was just dust and ashes, before God gave him his wealth back, before he had. And if you listen to my podcast on Eov, I point out that it wasn't Eov's wealth came back because from his friends, right? Because his family, people came and gave him money so that he got help him get back on his feet, right? Right? It was a result of his good actions from beforehand, right? That brought Eov to that helped him rebuild. So it never really ended. The process of being good did pay off for Eov in the end. Because had he had been an idiot, a jerk his whole life, nobody would have helped him out at the end, right? It was because he was good that he was able to rebuild his life. So we do see that when we act good, there is a good payoff, but we can't live our lives with that expectation. You know, we can't expect it to go, everything's going to be great. I'm going to be good, and Ojo Terto, everything's going to be good, everything's going to be good. No, that's just not how it works. You know, it might not be. You know, there are plenty of people, and Viktor Frankl makes this point, and so does Edith Eger. Plenty of people that had the same inner life of love, but ended up in the gas chamber. Why?
Yeah.
You know? All right, yeah, go ahead. I think Jeff, you had it. Go ahead.
Just two brief points because it's getting late. 2 years ago, I did a book report on Edith Eger's book.
Okay.
And I wanted to mention two things. One, you can actually see her. 2 years ago, she's still alive. She's lived like the late 90s. And you can go on YouTube, put her name in, guys, and you can see her. It's an hour interview because she was really did a lot of press thing. The other thing is, I think she would love to hear your presentation. And indeed, because things are so modern, I may even take the liberty, if I can do it, is sending her your presentation because she's a very humble person. And to have you focus on the fact that there are only one of two books that we need to read in our lifetime, and that's one of them. I think it's a great compliment, and I think she would be shocked, frankly, because she's so humble. But anyway,
Well,
I strongly
yeah, I mean,
advise you.
no, yeah, no, thank you. That would be a huge privilege. I really did mean it though. Like you
I know.
cannot not read these books. There's no excuse for
And
it.
I also wanted to thank you. It was a remarkable lecture presentation. And I thank you so much for it.
All
What
right,
is
thank
the
you.
title of her book again?
The
It's called
choice.
The Choice. This is what it looks, The Choice.
There it is. Yeah.
And it's
It's
by
a
Dr.
short book and
Edith
free.
Eva Eger.
Yeah. And she's like in her late 90s
Thank
and is an amazing woman,
Yeah.
obviously. Okay.
So when you stop the recording, I have a joke
All
about
right.
that. Or
Okay.
maybe a
All
true
right,
story,
well,
I don't know.
I have yeah, we've probably a lot of good stories. Well, I will stop the recording. I'll leave it on for a minute if you want to tell your joke. Okay, so anyway, just want to thank you everyone for joining us again. Just wish you a great evening, and next week, believe I won't be here. I'm gonna be thank God I'll be in the Holy Land celebrating Hanukkah with my son in Jerusalem. So I will not be giving the class, but I will be the week after. So we'll keep rolling and we'll learn about Nisyonot tests, right? That's what we'll be doing next. All right, I'm going to end the recording now. Okay.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.